In the shadows of Ouagadougou's presidential palace, President Ibrahim Traoré stares at satellite images revealing what he's long suspected: ECOWAS forces positioning for a midnight strike to remove him from power. The young military leader who dared to defy Western influence now faces the ultimate test of sovereignty, with Russian mercenaries whispering promises in one ear and Chinese diplomats negotiating in the other. Traoré must decide who to trust when everyone wants something in return. But as the invasion clock ticks down, an unexpected ally emerges from the south, forcing Traoré to confront the moral question that has haunted every African leader since independence: is freedom truly possible when you're caught between global powers who see your country as nothing but a chessboard? When the first shots are fired at midnight, the answer will shake the foundations of power across the continent. Tune into courageous voices for a story that will leave you on edge. The last light of day filtered through the wooden blinds of the presidential office as Ibrahim Traoré studied the economic reports. 6 months of ECOWAS sanctions had brought Burkina Faso to its knees. Food prices had tripled, hospitals were running out of medicine, the people suffering weighed on him like a physical burden. Mr. President, Defense Minister Konaté's deep voice broke the silence. The northern garrison reports another attack, 27 civilians dead. Traoré looked up at his trusted cabinet, Konaté, with his soldiers bearing, Foreign Minister Dio nervously adjusting her headscarf, and Intelligence Chief Uraego, whose perpetual frown had deepened in recent weeks. ECOWAS claims the sanctions will continue until we restore constitutional order, Dio said. They're not interested in our transition timeline, they're not interested in timelines at all, Uraego interjected, placing a folder on the desk. They want us gone. These satellite images show unusual military movements in Côte d'Ivoire and Ghana. My sources confirm joint exercises, but the troop numbers suggest something larger. Traoré leafed through the photographs. An invasion force possibly. They've been meeting with French officials behind closed doors. The weight of 21 million Burkinabe citizens pressed down on Traoré's shoulders. He'd seized power, promising security and sovereignty, yet both were now in peril. They think because we're young, because we're small, that we'll break, Traoré said, rising to look out over Ouagadougou. But they forget that even lions start as cubs. What are your orders, Mr. President? Konaté asked. Traoré turned, resolution hardening his features. Contact our allies in Mali and Niger and reach out to Moscow. It's time we showed ECOWAS what happens when you corner a lion. What hidden moves will Traoré make next? Stay with courageous voices to find out. The chandeliers of Abuja's Presidential Conference Center cast a harsh glow over the emergency ECOWAS session. Secretary General Emmanuel Oae stood at the podium, his tailored suit and authoritative voice disguising the fact that he was delivering someone else's message. The situation in Burkina Faso has deteriorated beyond acceptable limits, Oae declared to the gathered presidents and prime ministers. Captain Traoré's regime shows no genuine commitment to returning to constitutional rule. Nigeria's representative leaned forward. Sanctions haven't worked. If anything, they've pushed Traoré closer to the Russians. Precisely, Oae replied, advancing to the next slide, showing Russian aircraft landing in Ouagadougou. Our intelligence indicates military advisors from Moscow have established a presence. Should Burkina Faso formally join Mali and Niger in their so-called alliance of Sahel states, we will face a Russian-backed bloc controlling critical uranium deposits and migration routes. The Senegalese president frowned. The French are concerned certainly, but do we have consensus for what you're suggesting? Oae's smile didn't reach his eyes. The United States and France have offered logistical support for a limited operation. We restore democracy, install a transitional government amenable to Western security concerns, and prevent another country falling into Moscow's orbit. Ghana's representative passed copies of a document around the table, a 72-hour ultimatum. Traoré steps down, accepts ECOWAS peacekeepers, or faces military intervention. This crosses a line, murmured the Togolese delegate. Setting this precedent, the precedent was set when Russia put boots on African soil. OA interrupted sharply, we either defend our regional sovereignty now or surrender it forever. The vote was taken, 74 against 4 abstentions. The ultimatum will be delivered tonight, OAE announced, already drafting the message that would give Traoré exactly 3 days to surrender the country he had seized. To save it. The unmarked cargo plane touched down at Ouagadougou's military airfield under cover of darkness. Traoré watched from his armored vehicle as 6 men in civilian clothes disembarked, led by a tall figure with the unmistakable bearing of a career soldier, Colonel Mikey Petrov. The man introduced himself with a firm handshake. Moscow sends its regards. The presidential compound's secure room had been swept for bugs twice before Petrov opened his laptop, displaying satellite imagery of ECOWAS military formations. They are more serious than we anticipated, Petrov said. Equipment is being moved to staging areas here, and here. American transport aircraft delivered communications equipment yesterday. Traoré studied the images and Russia's position. We stand with our African partners against Western imperialism, Petrov replied smoothly. A shipment of anti-aircraft systems can be here within 48 hours. Additionally, we can provide technical advisors, former military with experience in unconventional warfare. Intelligence Chief Urago's eyes narrowed. Wagner Group, let's call them patriotic volunteers. Petrov smiled thinly. President Putin has authorized substantial support packages. At what cost? Urago pressed. Petrov's expression remained pleasant. Russia seeks mutually beneficial partnerships. Perhaps we might discuss certain mining concessions when the crisis passes. For now, our priority is your government's survival. After Petrov departed to make arrangements, Urago lingered. They want the gold fields in Pura, he said bluntly, the same deposits Western companies have coveted for decades. Traoré gazed out at the capital's twinkling lights. Do we have a choice? ECOWAS forces are mobilizing as we speak. There's always a choice, Mr. President, Urago replied, but rarely a good one. The question is whether Russian bombs protecting us today become Russian chains tomorrow. Traoré's phone buzzed with the ECOWAS ultimatum, 72 hours to surrender power. The clock was ticking. Dawn had barely broken when Intelligence Chief Urago placed the intercepted communications on Traoré's desk. The president's hands trembled slightly as he recognized the signature at the bottom, Philippe Zongo, his deputy defense minister and former academy classmate. We confirmed it through 3 separate channels, Urago said quietly. He's been providing ECOWAS with our defensive positions, troop movements, weapons inventories, everything they would need to plan an effective invasion. Traoré's expression remained stone-like. Bring him here now. When the presidential guards escorted Zongo into the office 30 minutes later, the deputy minister's dignified composure surprised them all. No fear, no shame, only resignation. Why? Traoré asked simply. Because you're leading us to slaughter, Zongo replied. Look around you, Ibrahim. The sanctions are crushing our people. Hospitals without medicine, markets without food. And for what? Your revolution. For our sovereignty, Traoré countered. For freedom from Western puppeteers. Zongo laughed bitterly, and straight into Russian hands instead. You call that freedom? ECOWAS was promised a peaceful transition if you step down voluntarily. No bloodshed, no invasion, while they install another puppet like the ones who let French companies plunder our gold for decades. Traoré slammed his fist down. I expected this betrayal from many, Philippe, never from you. History will judge who betrayed Burkina Faso, Zongo said softly. The man who fought hopeless battles for pride or the man who sought compromise to save lives. As guards led Zongo away, Defense Minister Konate entered, his face grim. How badly are we compromised? Traoré asked. Completely. We must assume they know all our contingency plans, defensive weaknesses, everything, and their forces are already moving toward positions that exploit those weaknesses. Traoré stared at the map of his beloved country, the walls closing in around him. Then we make new plans immediately. The Chinese delegation arrived without warning, their diplomatic convoy sweeping through the guarded gates with unusual urgency. Lin Wei, Beijing's special envoy for West African affairs, moved with practiced efficiency, dispensing with usual protocols. President Traoré. She greeted him in flawless French. "We have little time." Lin produced a small digital tablet displaying high-resolution satellite imagery timestamp. Just hours earlier, ECOWAS special forces are already infiltrating across your southern border. The main assault is planned for tomorrow at midnight. Traoré studied the images showing troop formations and equipment that matched Uruguay's intelligence. China has substantial investments in Burkina Faso's infrastructure, Lin continued, and we view regional stability as paramount to our economic partnerships across West Africa. And what does Beijing propose? Traoré asked cautiously. "We can immediately introduce a UN Security Council resolution condemning external interference in your internal affairs. Our veto would block any attempt to legitimize ECOWAS's military action." Defense Minister Konate raised an eyebrow. "The diplomatic route hasn't proven effective against Western determination so far." Lin smiled thinly. "This would be accompanied by explicit warnings regarding our economic relationships with participating ECOWAS states." Nigeria, for instance, has received $17 billion in Chinese financing for infrastructure projects that could be reconsidered. Foreign Minister Dio leaned forward, "And China's price for this intervention, preferential access to mineral exploration in the Gaur region." Lin replied without hesitation. "Specifically the manganese and copper deposits." Traoré paced the room, acutely aware of the Russian military advisors waiting in the adjacent chamber with their own offers of fighter jets and anti-aircraft systems. Two global powers suddenly concerned with Burkina Faso sovereignty, he observed bitterly, one offering weapons that would make us a military client, the other offering diplomacy that would make us an economic vassal. Lin's expression remained impassive. "The clock is ticking, Mr. President. Which form of partnership would you prefer?" The national broadcast system crackled to life at noon. Traoré's resolute face appearing on screens across Burkina Faso. He stood in military fatigues, no longer the polished statesman, but a commander ready for battle. "Citizens of Burkina Faso," he began, "I speak to you at our nation's darkest hour. Foreign powers conspire to violate our sovereignty under the false banner of restoring democracy. Their true aim is to control our resources and return us to colonial subjugation." His voice grew stronger, eyes burning with conviction. "I call upon every able-bodied Burkinabe to defend our homeland." Report to district centers for assignments. "We are not alone in this struggle for African dignity." The response was immediate and overwhelming. Farmers with machetes, students with homemade shields, veterans with ancient rifles, they flooded the streets of Ouagadougou. By nightfall, civilian barricades had transformed the capital into a fortress of determination, if not military strength. In the presidential compound's communication center, Foreign Minister Dio worked tirelessly, reaching out to every African government not aligned with ECOWAS. Most offered sympathy but little else until a secure line connected her to Pretoria. "Madam Minister," the deep voice of South African President Cyril Ramaphosa resonated through the speaker. "We've been monitoring the situation closely, Mr. President." Dio responded urgently, "We need more than monitoring. ECOWAS forces will cross our borders within hours." A moment of silence followed. South Africa has consistently opposed external intervention in African affairs. This ECOWAS action, clearly backed by Western powers, sets a dangerous precedent. "Then help us," Dio pleaded, "not with words, but action. Check your secure channel in 30 minutes. Cyril Ramaphosa replied, "My military advisors have developed a proposal that might surprise both Burkina Faso and those pressuring you, something that changes the entire equation." As she hung up, Dio allowed herself a flicker of hope. Perhaps Africa could still solve an African problem without becoming another proxy battlefield for global powers. What game-changing move will South Africa make? Stay tuned to Courageous Voices. The war room beneath the presidential palace pulsed with tension as the midnight deadline approached. Digital maps displayed real-time troop movements, red dots multiplying along the southern borders. ECOWAS special forces have breached 3 crossing points, Defense Minister Konate reported grimly. Our outposts are engaging, but they're overwhelmed. Colonel Petrov, the Russian advisor, hunched over communications equipment with Burkina Faso officers, directing defensive movements with practiced efficiency. We've repositioned anti-aircraft units here and here, he indicated, but without air support, they'll push through by morning. President Traoré stared at the unfolding disaster, exhaustion etched into his features. The People's Militia had shown remarkable courage, but courage alone couldn't stop trained soldiers with air support. The door opened silently as Lin Wei entered, her composed demeanor contrasting with the room's desperate energy. The UN Security Council is convening an emergency session, she announced. As promised, China is prepared to veto any resolution recognizing this invasion. And what good is that if Ouagadougou falls tonight? Konate demanded. International legitimacy matters, Lin countered. Without it, ECOWAS becomes an occupying force, not a peacekeeping one. She approached Traoré with a document. However, my government requires certain assurances. This grants Chinese companies exclusive rights to all newly discovered mineral deposits for 30 years. Traoré scanned the paper, his expression darkening. This would surrender our resource sovereignty for a generation. It guarantees your political sovereignty now, Lin replied. Coolly, we need your signature before casting our veto. Colonel Petrov stepped forward. President Putin has authorized immediate deployment of air defense specialists if you formalize our military partnership instead. The room fell silent as multiple communication systems suddenly chimed simultaneously. Mr. President, Intelligence Chief Uraego called urgently. Multiple aircraft entering our airspace from the south. His face showed confusion. South African transport planes requesting emergency landing clearance, and he added, bewilderment evident. President Cyril Ramaphosa is on the secure line requesting to speak with you immediately. 3 South African military transport planes descended through the night sky over Ouagadougou's airport, their landing lights cutting through darkness like harbingers of an impossible hope. President Traoré stood on the tarmac, watching as the massive cargo doors opened to reveal not weapons, but people. Dozens of officials in diplomatic attire and military observers in distinctive South African uniforms. Ambassador Nossi strode forward, extending his hand. President Cyril Ramaphosa sends his regards. We have 173 diplomatic personnel, military observers, and humanitarian staff ready to deploy throughout your capital. The Traoré struggled to comprehend. Deploy for what purpose? To serve as witnesses, Nossi explained as his team efficiently unloaded equipment. By dawn, South African observers will be positioned at hospitals, power plants, government buildings, and civilian centers, all wearing our national insignia. Understanding dawned in Traoré's eyes, making it impossible for ECOWAS to bomb without risking South African casualties. Precisely, no African nation would dare attack facilities hosting official South African personnel, and Western powers certainly cannot afford the diplomatic catastrophe of killing our citizens while claiming to restore democracy. Back at the presidential palace, the war room's atmosphere had transformed. Lin and Colonel Petrov watched with barely concealed frustration as South African officers integrated into Burkina Faso's command structure, establishing secure communications with Pretoria. This changes nothing, Petrov insisted. You still need Russian military assistance. Our Security Council veto remains essential, Lin added. Foreign Minister Dio couldn't suppress her smile. It changes everything. President Cyril Ramaphosa has just made any attack on Ouagadougou an attack on South Africa, the continent's strongest military power. The strategy became clearer when President Cyril Ramaphosa's voice emerged from the secure video link addressing all parties. Burkina Faso's sovereignty is not negotiable, his authoritative voice declared, "But neither is African unity. We propose a Pan-African mediation framework not dictated by Russia, China, or Western interests, but by African solutions to African problems." For the first time in days, Traoré allowed himself a moment of genuine hope. The global chessboard had suddenly acquired an unexpected player. Dawn broke over a transformed landscape, not just physically with South African flags now visible at strategic points throughout Ouagadougou, but diplomatically. In the presidential palace's Grand Hall, Traoré and Ambassador Nossi stood before cameras broadcasting across the continent. Today, Burkina Faso and South Africa announced the Sahel Southern Economic Partnership. Traoré declared, "This framework offers participating West African nations preferential access to South African markets, investment funds, and technological cooperation outside ECOWAS's restrictions." Ambassador Nossi detailed the specifics: reduced tariffs, infrastructure financing, and critically a currency stabilization fund backed by South Africa's central bank, a direct counter to the CFA franc system long criticized as a tool of French neocolonial control. African solutions to African challenges, Nossi emphasized, without preconditions from east or west. Within hours, encrypted communications flooded in from neighboring countries. Guinea, already suspended from ECOWAS, immediately signaled its intention to join. More surprisingly, Benin and Togo, ostensibly supporting ECOWAS's position, secretly reached out to explore participation while maintaining plausible deniability. In Abuja, Secretary-General OAE faced a fracturing coalition. The Nigerian delegation, concerned about South African economic competition, demanded immediate military action. Ghana and Côte d'Ivoire, however, hesitated, unwilling to confront both Burkina Faso and South Africa. The situation has changed. Côte d'Ivoire's representative argued, "South African involvement complicates everything." Nothing has changed. OAE insisted desperately, "We have Western support, do we?" Ghana's foreign minister interrupted, displaying messages from European capitals suddenly distancing themselves from the operation. "They're abandoning us because they fear confrontation with South Africa." OAE's phone rang, the French Ministry of Foreign Affairs requesting reassessment of operational parameters. Meanwhile, in Ouagadougou, Russian and Chinese representatives watched from the sidelines, their leverage evaporating as an African solution emerged. "We should discuss a different arrangement," Lin suggested to Colonel Petrov as they observed the South African delegation expanding its footprint, one that acknowledges new realities. Petrov nodded grimly. "Moscow won't be pleased. They promised certain parties that Burkina Faso's resources would soon be secured." The ECOWAS Emergency Summit convened in chaotic disarray as leaked documents flashed across delegates' screens. Confidential communications between Secretary-General OAE and Western officials promising military and financial support that had evaporated overnight. The carefully orchestrated invasion plan collapsed under the weight of international scrutiny and African resistance. "I hereby tender my resignation," OAE announced stiffly, exiting amid murmurs of betrayal and manipulation. The invasion was formally cancelled by unanimous vote, replaced by a face-saving call for renewed dialogue. In Ouagadougou's Independence Square, thousands gathered to celebrate. President Traoré appeared alongside South African representatives and envoys from Mali and Niger. The crowd roared as he raised his hands in triumph. "Today marks not just Burkina Faso's victory but Africa's awakening," Traoré declared. "We have shown that our sovereignty is not negotiable, that African nations can stand together against external pressure whether from east or west." The formation of an expanded alliance of Sahel states with South Africa as a formal observer sent shock waves through international diplomatic circles. This new bloc spanning from West Africa to the continent's southern powerhouse represented an unprecedented realignment of African geopolitics. Russia and China, recognizing the shifting landscape, quickly adjusted their approaches. Colonel Petrov offered military training programs with no political conditions while Lin proposed infrastructure investments based on mutually beneficial terms. Both were accepted but on Burkina Faso's terms. limited in scope with full transparency requirements. Most significantly, Traoré announced a new transition roadmap towards civilian governance, not on ECOWAS or Western timelines, but through an African-monitored process preserving the core principle of resource sovereignty. As the sun set on this new reality, Traoré stood with Defense Minister Konaté on the presidential palace balcony. "We walk between giants without being crushed," Konaté observed, "because we found our own strength," Traoré replied, "not in weapons or wealth, but in unity with those who share our vision of a truly independent Africa." Below them, the capital pulsed with renewed hope. The path ahead remained challenging, but for the first time, it was truly their own. What would you do if global powers tried to erase your country's future overnight? Stay with courageous voices. What would you do if global powers tried to erase your country's future overnight? Comment below. Should African nations rely on outsiders or stand united on their own terms? Subscribe now for more real, raw stories that mainstream media won't touch on. Courageous voices. Like this video if you believe Africa must decide its own destiny. Share this with someone who still thinks independence is just a word. This isn't just a story, it's a turning point. This story was almost buried by mainstream media. Share before they take it.